stay my hand and say we don't need to bother with legislation. But I think an increasing recognition that these are the kinds of responsibilities that social media companies need to take more seriously. I think this committee's played its part in that process, if I may say so, and I think others have too. And I think it's important that that process continues. But we've made it clear that however good they are between now and the point that a regulator starts, it won't defray the need for a regulator, because this is an ongoing and moving landscape.
No, indeed, I think we certainly agree on that. But would your message be to the tech companies, though, that you can't afford to wait until the regulator is created before you start to improve your act, that failure to adhere to the codes of practice now could end you up in trouble with the regulator in the future?
Well, certainly, I don't think it's right to say to the online companies you can wait until the regulator's in business before you behave in the way in which a regulator will come to expect. And I've been also very assiduous, I hope, in making it clear that I will not expect, under these provisions, anything unreasonable of social media companies. We expect them to behave reasonably. The word's very clearly written into the white paper, and I hope it'll be clearly written into the legislation too. So we're asking them to behave in a reasonable way. I think we should ask them to do that as of now, and we should expect them to build up that capacity to act reasonably in keeping their users as safe from online harms as they can. So no, I don't believe that there's an arbitral moment where the regulator starts and everything before that is forgiven and everything after that is regulated. But, of course it is true that the regulator can't take action until it has the legal powers to do so. So it has to be, even if it ends up being an existing regulator with extended powers, it has to be given the authority to act, which only primary legislation can give it. And the penalties, which again we would want to hear people's views on as to how extensive they should be, how high up the scale we should go. But the penalties that the regulator will have available to it will, of course, only also be available to it when it starts business.
Yes.
So I think you're right. I don't think we should say or suggest to online companies that there is a hard boundary between the point at which the regulator starts and everything that happened before it. We expect good behaviour now. I think we're right to expect good behaviour now. And we would expect that good behaviour to continue on through the point at which the regulator begins.
You mentioned, just with regards to the regulator itself specifically, its power would seem to rest in the ability to levy large fines. You've, I think, cited the example of the Information Commissioner's fining powers under GDPR. Do you consider that this regulator would need to be able to fine up to the same sort of level that the ICO can, so up to 4% of global revenues?
Yeah, I do, and I think those are the sorts of scales of fine that we do envisage for precisely the reasons that we've given the ICO that kind of capacity, because these are very large companies with very significant global footprints. We need to be in a position to make them sit up and take notice of the provisions that we are enacting in law, and I think it requires penalties of that nature. Now, precisely where we end up on penalties will be determined by how we proceed through the consultation and beyond, and Parliament will have something to say itself about the range of penalties that we would wish to implement, and it won't just be fines. We're very keen to look at other types of penalty too, and you'll see set out in the white paper that we think it's worth considering also individual director liability, and at the top end of the scale, ISP blocking, where it's necessary to do that. But I think also we should look at the other ways in which the regulator can have an impact on the behaviour of social media companies. And I think, again, something that we're starting to see is social media companies more and more aware of the damage to their collective reputations in failure to act. So some of the transparency powers that we expect the regulator to be given so that it can identify what those companies are doing, and, of course, by extension, what they are not doing, and publicising that in a way that will draw attention to it among the customers of those social media companies is helpful. And I think it's a combination of penalties and the other powers we want the regulator to have to start to draw behaviour in the right direction.
Do you feel that if the regulator is investigating something that's happened to someone in this country who's been exposed to harmful content, and there's been a consequence of that, now, should the regulator have the power to investigate that if the company serving that data was based overseas, but nevertheless the offence, so to speak, had taken place in the UK?
Yeah, my view is that the parameters of the regulator's activity and the rules that we'll set out in statute are there to cover and protect citizens of the UK. And that applies whether or not the company we're talking about is based in the UK or not. one of the reasons why, when we come to think about penalties, we need to consider the practical difficulties of some of those penalties when you're dealing with a company that doesn't have a significant corporate presence in the UK. Worth saying, though, that about 85% of the traffic that we're all concerned about passes through platforms that do have a significant corporate presence in the UK. So as things stand, I think we would have purchase on most of them. And, of course, the reason that I wanted to include ISP blocking in the list is that in the end, when you're dealing with a company that has no corporate presence in the UK, that is your ultimate sanction, and that would apply to a website, a platform based wherever it may be. So I do expect that we should give our regulator powers to deal with such companies, but I also expect that companies which want to operate in what is a very significant UK market will respect the fact that they will have to comply with UK laws and rules.
Where ISP blocking has been brought in, do you think then it should be part of the duty of care of other tech companies to make it difficult to find that company? So, for example, would you expect if a site had been blocked, that it shouldn't receive due prominence in Google search rankings, for example?
Well, I think it's up to the regulator to start to put meat on the bones of the duty of care, and I'm reluctant as a minister to start to be too prescriptive, though I hope what the committee will recognise is that in the course of the white paper we've given some indications of the sorts of things we'd expect the regulator to be putting into various duties of care. But for me, the great attraction of the duty of care model is it sits above all of the codes of practice, and it requires of online companies that they do everything they reasonably can to keep their users safe. And I think it would be difficult for an online company to explain to a regulator that they were doing that and meeting their duty of care if there were websites that the regulator had itself deemed so unacceptable that it believed that ISP blocking for those websites was appropriate, and the other platform wasn't doing everything it could to prevent its users having access to that material. Yeah. So I think these things are cumulative, but my expectation would be, if the system works as we hope it will, and we hope to design it so that it will, then the expectation would be it would be hard to persuade the regulator you're within your duty of care if that's what happens.
Yeah. There's a couple of sort of final specific things for me. I read reading the response to the committee's recommendation that social media companies were neither publishers nor platforms, but something in between, and they had a limited legal liability. I mean, the department's response is based on the principle of duty of care in the white paper. Yeah. One reading it might sound like we disagree. I think it sounds like we agree, but we're using different language to describe it. So I just wanted to ask you which you thought it was. Do you feel that the duty of care principles do imply a limited legal liability towards social media companies to remove harmful content?
Well, I think it implies a clear responsibility to do so. I think the reason that I've shied away from the publisher platform distinction is that I'm not sure it's always a helpful distinction, and I think it's probably not right to say that online platforms are publishers in the same sense as other media institutions are publishers. And that's why I think if we were to gravitate onto that territory, I think what we would do is we'd hand the social media companies a useful weapon in saying, well, clearly we're not that, because look at other things that are that, we're different to those. But for me, the real issue is responsibility. It's about whether you should be expected to take responsibility for what you do as a platform. And the answer to that unequivocally, in my view, is yes. How do you make sure those responsibilities are complied with? You set out an overarching duty of care with codes of practice underneath. So you're probably right. I don't think there's a million miles between what I think and what you think. But I think it's important that online companies have a clear structure to look at so they can understand what they have to do, because it is legitimate for them to say, well, don't just tell me I've got a duty of care. You're going to have to tell me what that really means. What do I have to do? What don't I have to do? And I think that as the regulator moves forward, starts to develop codes of practice, that will become clearer. The shading in will happen so that they'll be able to see what they have to do. But I'm equally unsympathetic to the argument some might choose to deploy later, which is, well, there was nothing in the codes of practice about that particular harm or that particular representation of it, so I didn't do anything about it, and based on the fact it wasn't in the codes of practice, I didn't have to under your system. That, in my view, would also be wrong, which is why the duty of care has to sit above.
I think that's right, because I think what would be disappointing is if all the duty of care principle was basically bundling together all the codes of practice, calling a duty of care.
Yes.
and then a new regulator could introduce new fines for failing in duty of care. But actually, I think what we want the companies to understand is that actually failure is a form of offence, that they have a in law responsibility to ensure the safety of their users.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think what we're not saying to online companies is you have a duty to comply with the codes of practice. We're saying you have a duty to comply with that duty of care. The regulator will hold you to account for whether you do so. Now, there will be some assistance for you and for the regulator in determining whether you have done so based on the codes of practice. For example, if you are complying with the code of practice, you've got a better argument with the regulator than if you're completely ignoring it. Same, by the way, applies to your own terms and conditions. If you're ignoring your own terms and conditions, you will find it harder with the regulator in persuading them that you've abided by your duty of care. But it is the duty of care that is the significant test. And that has to be there because the guiding principle for me is that because this is such a fast-moving landscape and the harms change so fast, if we were to do it the other way and to say it is compliance with the codes of practice that matters, the regulator will be playing perpetual catch-up. Every time the harm changes, they'll need to draft a new code of practice and need to get it approved. By the time they've done all of that, the harm will have changed again. So it's important that we have the duty of care in place, and that's the operating principle.
So finally, one of the issues we raised was the issue of whether inferred data is personal data, which is an issue that the Information Commissioner has raised with us on several occasions now. And I don't think the Department's response was entirely clear on this point. I mean, it could be read as, on one level, as saying that, well, if the Information Commissioner thinks it is, then it's for her to demonstrate through the courts that she's right. But is that the Department's position, or do you feel this is something that needs to be interrogated further?
Well, I'll be entirely honest. I think it does need to be interrogated further. I don't think there's a clear view on this. I think it's difficult to be precise because it depends what you mean by inferred data. I think that quite a lot of what we as politicians do is infer things from the data that we have. And I don't think all of that is illegitimate. So in the end, this is a dialogue, I think, between us and the Information Commissioner about exactly what we mean by inferred data. And I will be honest and say I have not reached a firm view because I think it depends what you mean by that term. And I would like to understand a little more clearly what the potential variants of inferred data are.
I suppose the most sort of specific example, the one that was certainly cited in our hearing for the Information Commissioner, was if you take some of the particular protected areas of data under GDPR, so data about someone's religious beliefs or their ethnicity, and say an individual on a platform like Facebook is choosing not to share that information, but nevertheless the platform is guessing what that information is and then selling that information to advertisers. Are they in fact selling something that is inferred from someone's personal data, and is that in essence the same as selling their personal data, which the Information Commissioner thinks it is?
Yeah, and you can argue this a number of ways, couldn't you? You could, I suppose, make the argument that what you're still doing is you're selling the data that enables you to make the inference. So it is that's the pernicious bit rather than the inference itself, which is why I have to say in two minds about whether I think inferred data as a concept is yet clearly enough defined for us to have a clear view about it. But I think this is something we go on talking to the Information Commissioner about.
But is this something you could see ultimately is tested in the courts rather than where there's amendment to the law?
Given my background, I never rule anything being tested in a court out. It's always possible, but I would prefer it if we got our own view of what we think it should mean, and we act accordingly. I'm not there yet, to be frank.
Okay. Ian Lucas.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Do you agree that Russia has mounted a sustained campaign of cyber espionage and election interference?
Cyber espionage, certainly. The evidence on that, I think, is clear. The view we take in relation to election interference, certainly in the UK, is that there is no evidence of successful interference with UK democracy. But there is very clear evidence, I think, that the Russians have attempted to manipulate information. They have obviously done so, for example, in relation to the Skripal poisonings. We think something like 40 different narratives put out by the Russians, none of which are remotely true. So there is clear intent, there's clear effort, We don't believe it's been successful in terms of.
Can I just take you back to election interference?
Yeah.
Do you think that there has been a campaign of election interference by Russia?
Not in this country. We see no evidence of it successfully doing so here.
Do you think there's been unsuccessful election interference?
That's very hard for us to tell. There is, in my view, there's three levels of response here. There's the national security response. So we expect our national security agencies to respond to Russia and its efforts to destabilise other countries, and they do so. Then there is the platform response, and we've talked a bit about that already within the context of the white paper, but disinformation in that sense is partly a responsibility of platforms to do something about, and we've tried to set out how that might be done. But then I think there's a public response too. I think we need the public to be more sceptical, the public to be more aware that some of the things they may be seeing and reading are inaccurate, and not just inaccurate, but deliberately created to be inaccurate by a foreign power. So there are three levels of response. What I think it's very difficult for us to say is to what degree people are being influenced by that kind of misinformation. We certainly don't see evidence that it's had a material impact on the outcome of democratic processes.
The words I initially put to you, I chose carefully because they were the words of the Prime Minister, who said to the House on the 5th of September 2018 that Russia had mounted a sustained campaign of cyber espionage and election interference. Do you agree with that?
Well, I do. I don't know what the Prime Minister was also talking about.
So which elections was she talking about?
Well, let me go on to say, I think that there is evidence of Russian interference in elections elsewhere in the world. What I'm saying is that as far as the UK is concerned, we see no evidence of successful interference in democratic exercises in this country. I'd be surprised if the Prime Minister had said anything other than that.
You are aware, however, that the Electoral Commission referred Mr Aaron Banks to the National Crime Agency for suspected criminal offences committed during the EU referendum on the 1st of November 2018. And furthermore, that this was after an investigation into whether Mr Banks was the true source of loans to Better for the Country, and that the Electoral Commission stated at the time that the law is that the loans and donations to the registered campaigns can only come from certain permissible sources, which essentially excludes overseas or foreign funding.
Yes.
So that reference was specifically about the overseas issue, and it's specifically related to election campaigns.
Well, what you're referring to is an investigation by the Electoral Commission leading potentially to criminal investigations too. You wouldn't expect me to comment on either of those. What I'm saying to you is that from the government's point of view, we have no evidence of Russian interference being successful in a democratic exercise in this country.
But that's not what your response says in your response to the committee. What you say is there is no evidence of successful foreign interference in UK democratic processes.
Yes.
Well, there is evidence because the Electoral Commission have referred an issue to the National Crime Agency for criminal investigation.
Right. Well, what you're
and that's on the basis of foreign interference.
Well, what you're putting to me, Mr. Lucas, is not a discrepancy between what I've just said to you and what's said in the report. What you're putting to me is that you disagree with both. And that's perfectly reasonable. There is no difference between what I've said to you this afternoon and what you've just read out in the response.
Well, with respect, there isn't. There is a difference because what is said in the report, the response to the report, is there is no evidence of successful foreign interference in UK democratic processes.
Yes.
Now, the reference by the Electoral Commission to the National Crime Agency is relating to democratic processes within the UK, isn't it?
Right. So your conclusion is that what I've said to you this afternoon and what's written in the report or the response to the report is inaccurate for that reason. You're not putting to me a difference between what I've said and what's said in that report.
Well, what you said was that you said you agreed with the Prime Minister.
That's always a good strategy, I find.
It is indeed, which is why I put her words to you. and she said that there had been electoral interference by Russia.
Yes, but as I say, I don't know the context of the comments that she was making, and I do think there's a difference between what we believe to have happened in other countries and what we believe to have happened in this country. What I originally said in answer to your question, because as I understood it, you were asking me about the United Kingdom, is that we have no evidence of successful interference in democratic processes within this country. That remains the case. It's what is said in our response to the committee's report. It's what I've said to you this afternoon.
What constitutes... Are you aware of unsuccessful election interference?
Well, as I said earlier, I think it's very difficult for us to quantify unsuccessful interference. What we believed...
Because you're crazy. What you're doing is you're adopting a wording that was adopted by the Foreign Office when we had another Foreign Secretary.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
And the wording that was adopted by the Foreign Office then was before the reference to the National Crime Agency. And the identical wording is now being used in the response from the DCMS report.
Well, look, I think it's important that both the Electoral Commission and the National Crime Agency and other agencies that have responsibilities in this space are able to proceed with the investigations they want to proceed with. Those investigations are not, to my knowledge, yet concluded. So I don't think we can say definitively what they will find.
That's exactly what you've done, because you've trotted out the same line that we've had repeatedly from the government, but it hasn't taken into account the change in the facts, which was the reference by the Electoral Commission to the National Crime Agency on the 1st of November 2018.
Well, I think it might be taking it a little far to say that's a change in the facts. What it is, it's an investigation, perfectly proper investigation, but it hasn't reached a conclusion. So I don't think we're in a position to say what the outcome of that investigation, or those investigations, plural, will be.
But that's what you've done.
No, I don't agree. What I've said is there's no evidence of interference by the Russians in what has happened in democratic exercises in this country. That's the position.
You haven't. What you said was there's no evidence of successful interference.
Right.
And this distinction between successful and unsuccessful, it's your distinction. It's the government's distinction. You've chosen the words.
Right. Well, I think the reason for the distinction is that we can be a little more definitive about successful interference than we can about unsuccessful interference, for the reasons I gave. But we don't believe there is evidence of successful interference. That's the position.
Think of everyone's sanity. Do you accept there is evidence of interference, Russian interference?
Well, look, are the Russians attempting to use misinformation and other means around the world? Yes, we think there is clarity about that. As I'd understood Mr. Lucas's initial question, he was asking about the UK. And on that point, I hope I've been clear. Forgive me, I may have read too much into it. But let me be clear. So in terms of the United Kingdom, we do not believe there is evidence of successful interference in the democratic process.
Just interference.
Right.
Yeah. What about interference?
Well, again, I mean, has anyone from Russia attempted to mislead anyone in this country? Yes, they have, because, as I've said, in relation to the Skripal poisonings, we're pretty clear that there have been a number of narratives generated from Russia which are wrong, and deliberately so.
What is frustrating about the government's position is that you're very clear about the Skripal incident, very clear about responsibility for that. But repeatedly, we received the same line from the government in the face of very substantial evidence that this committee has seen, and also evidence that has brought about the Electoral Commission making a substantial decision on the basis of the evidence that they have seen. I don't need to tell you about evidence. The reference to the National Crime Agency isn't undertaken lightly, but you're ignoring it.
Well, I'm not ignoring it.
In your evidence, you're ignoring it because you're using the same words which you've trotted out, not you personally, but your predecessors and the government, trotted out before the 1st of November, that you're now trotting out now.
Well, I'm certainly not ignoring it, and I think it's important, as I've said, that the National Crime Agency have the opportunity to consider carefully what material is supplied to them and what they can discover by their own means. And we should all, I think, want to see what they come up with and act accordingly. But I very much support the exercise that's being engaged in. I think the Electoral Commission should have the opportunity to supply what they believe the NCA should look at, and the NCA should investigate. That, I think, is what's happening, and I support that.
Okay. Could I just ask you about another area relating to elections? We've got an election coming up in a couple of weeks' time, as you know. And one of my areas of concern that I've raised with the Information Commission and with the committee generally is around Facebook groups. And the fact that Facebook groups, which are very often of a very substantial size, which are closed, are being used within both inside and outside election campaigns to influence political opinion. Now, I have not been able to find any specific response within either the Cabinet Office documents or any of the responses that I've seen from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, Digital Culture, Media and Sport, on this issue. Is it an issue that the Department has considered?
Yes, there are two things, I think, in this. The first is the issues I was discussing with the Chairman around what we can do to encourage online platforms in the space of disinformation to keep their users safer. And there are some provisions that we've suggested in the white paper as to how that might be done, one of which is to ensure that platforms do what they can to address this concept of echo chambers, where people are talking only to those who agree with them and are not getting a broad spread of opinion and information. That's difficult, and I think we all understand why that's difficult. But nonetheless, it's something that we think the regulator will want to consider. Then there's the question of what you do about private groups rather than the public internet. That's usually seen through the prism of encryption. That's not obviously the point that you're making to me. But both of those are part, I think, of the process we've been going through in the white paper. And I don't pretend, and never have I hope, that we've got all the answers yet, hence the process that we're undertaking. And some of these issues will require some working through, partly in the course of consultation, partly when we have a regulator in shadow form or in actual form, in the way in which that regulator would seek to address them. But what you've seen in the white paper is our best effort to set the parameters of the kinds of things that we want the regulator and everyone else in consultation to start to think about. Those two connected issues are certainly among them.
The difficulty at the moment is the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee raised in a Home Affairs Select Committee session with Facebook the fact that she had received some absolutely appalling abuse from within a closed Facebook group.
Yes.
And these sorts of issues are being repeatedly raised with people like Facebook.
Yeah.
And we've turned blue in the face with our exhortations of Facebook.
Yes.
And nothing is being done. And this is continuing day by day by day. And I have to say that female members of Parliament are particularly being abused in this way. When you spoke to Facebook and to Mr. Zuckerberg, who you had the privilege of meeting, did you raise issues like this?
We did talk about these sorts of issues, and it's one of the attractions for me of the duty of care model, because it's quite clear to me that in the list of harms that we've identified, which is not a static list but is a good starting point, I think, included among them, as you will have seen, are harassment and intimidation. And I couldn't agree more with what you say about the tone of public discourse at the moment and the particular difficulties that our female colleagues face, not exclusively, but particularly in the way in which abuse is hurled around online, not least in closed Facebook groups. Now, one of the things that we wanted to look at was whether or not, because harassment and intimidation, as you know, could conceivably be criminal offences, and in my view, where the evidence supports it, those prosecutions should be proceeded with. Where they are, the question is, do we already have sufficient authority for law enforcement to be able to get from Facebook and others the information they need to identify who's responsible for this? Now, I think what we've discovered is that there are such powers. We're not entirely certain yet that they are being implemented and used in the way they should be, and if we can improve upon that, we seek to do so. But the key question when you're dealing with potentially criminal behaviour is, can we enforce a right to know who these people are for law enforcement, so law enforcement can pursue them as appropriate. That's what should happen, and if the system needs tightening up, then I'm perfectly prepared to use the measures that we're looking at here in broader context to do exactly that.
Do you think there's a case for limiting the size of private social media groups?
I'm not sure that that is the answer to the question you're raising, because however big or small they may be, if abuse is originating from them and it's happening under cover of anonymity, then we need to address that. So I don't think it necessarily affects the size of the individual Facebook group. What I think we need to do is to make sure that we've got the powers in place for law enforcement to identify who these people are so that action can be taken against them.
In the next parliamentary session.
Yeah.
Do you know when that's going to start?
I don't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to just go back to the previous debate you and Mr. Lucas were having about interference.
Yes.
So you said you accept there's Russian interference with regards to disinformation around the Skripal poisoning case.
Yes.
Yes. Do you accept there has been Russian interference around politics and elections in this country as well?
No, as I say, we've seen no evidence of that.
At all?
Well, it's difficult for us to be definitive about any efforts that may have been made by anyone sourced from Russia to influence voters in the course of an election. I don't think I could make anything like as definitive a statement as that. I think the best I can do is to repeat what I've said, which is that we don't see evidence of successful interference in the democratic process here.
Okay, so I mean, the committee's report sets out examples of Russian interference in politics in this country, political messaging. Facebook have said there was an attempt to buy ads, I think in a tiny amount, but nevertheless, intent was there. Has the government ever asked any of the agencies that it works with to look into this, to actually look for evidence of Russian interference in elections that we're very familiar with in other countries? We would have good grounds to believe it could have happened here as well. Has the government ever asked any of its agencies to investigate this?
Well, I suspect that's a question you should ask the Cabinet Office, not me, because it's specifically related to democratic election processes. But as I say, I don't think there's any doubt.
But to your knowledge, the Secretary of State?
No, I don't. I can't give you a list of particular inquiries.
Or any?
Or any. But I do think it's a question that you can legitimately ask the Cabinet Office in relation to elections. What I've said is I think that it's pretty clear, and I don't think there's any real dispute about this, that there have been Russian efforts at misinformation, not just in this country, but in other countries too.
The issue here is, if I may, the issue here is about, it's not just about what happens in the regulated electoral period. It's about interference in the politics of another country. And I would say that there is evidence of Russian interference. I think we've cited it in our committee reports. There's plenty of evidence in other countries. And would you not find it surprising if at no point someone in the government had said to one of our agencies, shouldn't we be checking this as well?
Well, as I say, I think there is a multi-layered approach to this which is underway. So as far as the intelligence...
So it is?
Well, as far as the intelligence agencies are concerned, they have an ongoing responsibility to deal with hostile state activity. That's what they're there for. That's what they do. They do it, in my experience, not just in this job but in the last one, extremely well. So that is underway. Absolutely it is. I cannot give you chapter and verse, and probably couldn't even if I knew in this context, of exactly what action is being taken in that field, but it clearly is happening and needs to happen. We're none of us, I think, naive about the intent, not just of Russia, but of other nations too, to seek to influence public opinion in this country, which is why it seems to me the appropriate response is first on a national security level, second, to expect more of platforms. That's what the White Paper seeks to do. It's the reason why the committee was right in the first place to focus on disinformation as a relevant and valid online harm, and why we expect a regulator, in conjunction with the parameters we give it, to do something about that and to have higher expectations of platforms to help protect their users from what is clear misinformation and signal where they believe that this is that kind of information. But the third area, and I don't want to lose sight of it because I think it's hugely important, is it's important for us to, as a citizen, all of us, and to encourage our fellow citizens, just to be more sceptical about what we see and hear. Now, we can't do that without help because we need to be given some assistance on how to determine what might be misinformation from what clearly isn't. That starts at school, goes all the way through our adult lives, and is part and parcel of what we shall expect a regulator to look at and what we shall expect to be funded by the industry as part of the general funding of the regulator's activity.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're getting at here is whether actually anyone is looking at this, because there is the whole agenda around protecting our cyber infrastructure, cyber security of the nation.
Yes.
Quite rightly a priority for our security intelligence services.
Yes.
But what I'm not convinced of is whether this issue of disinformation, of the attempt to interfere in the politics and democracy of this country by external agencies, is something that is being prioritised and being looked at. And if it's not, I would suggest, based on the experience of other countries, and I think some of the evidence that we've published during our inquiry too, it should be. And that would be a surprising gap if it's not.
Yeah, understood. I'm not suggesting that there's nothing being done. Quite the opposite. I think, though, that the framework within which you do it is partly national security, partly attention on the platforms, partly public education and awareness raising. That, in my view, is the way you respond to that. Now, what I'm setting out in the white paper is two of those three components. I'm not responsible for the third. But on the other two, I think there is some urgency to this, as we discussed earlier on. And I would expect not just for a regulator to be focused on it, but for us all to be focused on it. And I would expect both of those elements to be significant parts of the legislation we're bringing forward.
Thank you. Julian Knight.
Thank you, Chair. Just to change tack ever so slightly, Secretary of State. You may have followed that the committee is currently conducting a investigation inquiry into gaming and immersive technologies.
Yes.
I'm just wondering what role you think, or what sort of focus the new regulatory framework set out within online harms will focus on the video game sector and also the new realities, the new augmented and virtual realities.
Well, I think in relation to the white paper, it's worth saying that the focus of the white paper is on user-generated content rather than professionally generated content, if I can put it like that. So I don't think within the confines of the white paper, and I go back to what I said earlier on about a manageable scope of any piece of legislation is likely to cover that. But that doesn't mean we're not interested in the subject as you are. I think there's a balance to be struck here. As the committee is well aware, the video games industry is a very successful one in this country. I hope it will stay so. These are significant product innovations. When we're looking at immersive technologies, whether they are augmented reality or virtual reality, they are going to be part and parcel of the games industry for the future. And I want the UK to be at the forefront of that process. So there is an economic imperative for us to support our games industry. However, it's also important that we are conscious of the potential downsides of what may be addictive behaviour. That applies not just, of course, to video games, it applies to many other activities as well, and within the confines of my portfolio we think about these issues in the context of gambling too. And there is, as the committee knows, an overlap. So it's important that we get that balance right between, on the one hand, supporting the video games industry to do well, as we hope it will, and to be innovative, and secondly, to make sure that we have dealt with the addictive possibilities for this kind of technology. It's worth saying, by the way, that some of these technologies are not just about the games industry. So for this committee's interest in tourism, as I have it, you can see very good examples. In Northumberland is a good example, as I saw it, where some of these technologies are being used to give people a completely different view of some of the facilities and attractions they're going to. That, in my view, is a good thing too. So this technology can be very positive. But as we develop this technology, we should be thinking about its potential downsides. We should be doing that on the basis of evidence and understanding. And we should be saying to the industry that you have a responsibility too to make sure you're not designing in a kind of addictive property to a game that shouldn't be addictive.
You decried before about the potential of having to change so fast, the landscape changes so fast, therefore you're concerned that you'll forever be running to catch up regulatory-wise. Isn't it therefore an oversight that you haven't included video game sectors, virtual and new realities within online harms?
Well, as I say, I think you can certainly see enough potential in the framework that we're setting out and the duty of care model to deal with augmented reality, virtual reality, where it forms part of user-generated content. And there will doubtless come a time where users can indeed generate that kind of content. It's a simple question of whether or not they have the technology to do so. I suppose the point I was making to you earlier is only that when you're talking about the video games industry, we're not there talking about user-generated content, we're talking about professional-generated content. There is a different set of considerations for that, because now those technological devices, those technological methods are only really available to the professionals. As and when they become available to all of us, I see absolutely no reason why the same principles that we've set out in the white paper shouldn't apply to them too. And we should be saying to platforms, it remains your responsibility to keep your users as safe as you reasonably can from harms. The point, as we were discussing earlier on, is those harms change over time, but your responsibility will stay the same. And actually, in my view, one of the reasons, again, that I think this is the right model, is your visibility of those harms and the way they change will be greater as an online platform than they are likely to be to us as legislators or indeed to the regulator. So we shouldn't be waiting for us as a legislator or the regulator to spot the harm. We should be asking the online platform to spot it as it arises and do something about it.
So you believe it's flexible enough?
I do.
That's what you're saying in that regard?
I do.
Because, I mean, you do differentiate between user and professional generated content, but they kind of
Yeah.
fold into each other much more. And one of those areas would be deep fake, for instance. I mean,
Yes.
have you had any particular thoughts on that? And the
Yes.
potential
I mean,
downside
again,
of
I think I'd probably distinguish between the creation of the deepfake, the technical process, and its promulgation. Because, again, what I think we ask online companies to do in saying to them you must do all that you're reasonably able to is to recognise that online platforms have a good deal of technical capacity to be able to distinguish as the technology, deepfake technology develops. I would hope the technology to identify it develops too. And I would want the online platforms to be deploying that technology in pursuit of greater safety for their users. That's what their duty of care will require them to do. Now, don't ask me exactly how that's done. That's a level of technical competence well beyond me. But what I do know is that these are very well-funded, very ingenious and very clever companies who use their technological wizardry for all sorts of things now. I expect them to deploy that capacity and that know-how in pursuit of their duty of care. And the point about the duty of care is it isn't fixed to a particular technology. It moves as the technology moves, and it remains your responsibility as an online company.
And what, does that also apply in terms of the misuse of data? I mean, we've come up in our inquiry the potential for that to happen. I'm just looking at a headline from the start of last month with Armour Games, a hack with basically led to 617 million online accounts. Some of these games are actually, they are so big. I don't think before we got started on this inquiry exactly the scale.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the size of countries in terms of their actual sort of user bases.
Yeah.
So in that respect then, do you have confidence that the regulatory framework that you are constructing will be able to effectively step in when there is the potential for misuse of data? And how will you effectively see that dovetailing with other parts of government in order to protect consumers, not just in terms of their individual data, just like a hack such as that, but for example, let's say the misuse of data for electioneering purposes or such as the colleague Mr. Lucas just spoke about a few minutes ago.
Yes, so I mean, two things. First of all, on the scale of these games and of the companies that are producing them, I mean, obviously as the committee's aware, the games industry is huge globally now. I think I'm right, bigger than the movie industry. Yeah, so these are very significant economic players, you're right, and that isn't likely to change anytime soon. In relation to the misuse of data, what I would say is that we have quite deliberately constructed an architecture of data protection in this country that we would say is tougher and more rigorous than many other countries have. We talked a little earlier about the powers that the Information Commissioner has, the opportunity to levy fines where there are breaches of the data protection rules and laws. They are very significant powers and they are very significant penalties. There is no reason in my mind why, if you're a games maker you're any more immune from the rules around data protection than any other company or entity would be. You're subject to them like anyone else is. So if you are misusing data and you find yourself the wrong side of our data protection rules, then you should expect to be subject to the ICO's jurisdiction and potentially to its penalties too. And however big these global entities may be, however big the games companies get, they're still going to sit up and take notice, I think, of fines which are potentially 4% of their global turnover.
In terms of screen time, I have a regular email comes in telling me, strangely if I'm there to read it, so
Physicians heal thyself.
telling me that I was delighted last week to understand that I was only averaging 4.5 hours a day, which is rather depressing. In terms of screen time, is there any way in which you consider that effectively the protections that are in place, because we in our inquiry when we went to the United States and we did about fake news over there, one of the things we were talking about there was effectively technology, it's a time stealer as well. Effectively, it's there in order to draw your attention in different directions. Is there any way in which you think that there is a role for government in terms of beefing up the warnings, the health warnings, the consumer protection around screen time?
Well, as you know, our colleagues in the health department have been looking at this, and the chief medical officer has produced a report on screen time specifically. I think this is quite a nuanced issue, actually. I don't think it is as straightforward as saying the number of hours you spend looking at a screen equals how bad all of this is for you. A large part of the question is, what are you looking at on your screen? Not so much how many hours are you looking at it, but how pernicious is the material. Hence, of course, the online harms agenda that we've been pursuing. So I think it's more than just the number of hours you spend looking at your screen. Having said that, I think the evidence is still in a state of flux. You can see some reports that say it is very, very bad for particularly the very young to be spending hours and hours staring at a screen. You can see other reports that say it doesn't make very much difference. I think probably we should factor in also questions of what you could be doing when you are looking at your screen instead. I think levels of social engagement around a family dinner table, as much as anywhere else, are affected by how much screen time we've got, and we're all guilty of it. I am too. So I think this is much more complicated than simply totaling up the number of hours you spend looking at a screen of any description. I think it's partly that, it's partly what you're looking at, it's partly what you're foregoing when you're spending your time with your screen. And I think all of those things as a society we have to get to grips with and understand more about. This is still relatively new technology, actually. We don't have years and years of research to judge how this has affected particularly young people. This is broadly the first generation that has spent all its time glued to a screen. And so I'm cautious about what evidence tells us yet, because I think it is potentially in flux still. But I also take the view that the precautionary principle applies, and that if you're sensible, what you do is do everything in moderation.
Just finally, Chair, just in terms of, because obviously I was there for the Secretary of State for Health's announcement on this particular area as well, mental health and online. Just in terms of that, do you think that there's a danger? I mean, you obviously referenced the Cabinet Office. Is there a danger that we are still, as government, we're operating in silos in this respect? That actually we do need to just step the game up when it comes to joined up thinking, when it comes to actually working together across government? And how close do you think we are to actually achieving that?
I think we can always do better about that in government. I think the silo risk is ever present. I think on this agenda there is a good deal of cross-government working. So, as you say, there are elements of this that the Health Secretary picks up and has spoken about. There are elements of this that, as we've already discussed this afternoon, the Cabinet Office takes primary responsibility for. And there are elements of it that DCMS takes responsibility for, many of which you can find in the white paper. I think, though, it's just worth adding one more point on how all of this ties together. One of the things that is pernicious about excessive screen time is not so much, again, the fact of the number of hours you spend looking at the screen. It's the ever-present nature of social media. And that links us into questions of bullying, which are significant concerns for the DfE. So there are a number of government departments that have an interest in this agenda. I think it's quite right to start to look at this as holistically as we can, hence the approach the white paper takes, hence the duty of care model, which of course, as you would expect, we've needed to clear through all of government, and all of my colleagues believe is the right way to proceed.
Thank you, Chair.
Just one thing I want to ask about, following Julian Knight's questions, is with regards to the new online harms regulatory system and the duty of care principles, would the regulator be free to apply those to other forms of companies? So if it was for example, a big game run by a company where it was felt the chat rooms associated with that game were being used to spread harmful material, do you believe the regulator could, on a case-by-case basis, call that in scope and have a conversation with the companies about what their responsibilities should be?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm keen to do is make sure that the regulator has the capacity to act in the space of user-generated content. And that means that, for example, I don't exclude from scope search engines because they are facilitating access to user-generated content. The other principles that I apply here are, first of all, we must be careful not to overload the regulator. So because this is such a wide space, potentially, I think we must be cautious not to say to a nascent regulator, you've got responsibility for covering off a massive area within the economy without giving them the resource and the capacity to deal with that. And thirdly, I want to make sure that we are not duplicating effort. So where there is already a regulatory structure in existence, I don't wish to trespass upon it. So, for example, when you look at the press, it is not an area that I think we should be asking the regulator to trespass upon because it is regulated in a different way. So those are the principles that I apply. We'll look at every case individually, but I think the regulator itself will start to get a feel for what it needs to reach into and what it doesn't. It's also important, I think, that we set clear expectations and manage those expectations around whether or not the regulator is an ombudsman or a regulator. And the answer is it's a regulator and not an ombudsman. And so although I think it's perfectly reasonable for a regulator to have its attention drawn to an individual case which might be evidence of a broader principle, I don't foresee this regulator picking up individual case studies and acting as an ombudsman would on them. It's a regulatory responsibility for the systems that online companies have rather than individual cases.
Yeah, I suppose the question I was really asking was, there are some forms of online entertainment, be it video games or be it services like Twitch, which live streams esports, which actually can, because of their popularity, can start to adopt the characteristics of social media. They're places where people get together and discuss things, and therefore people can use that to discuss bad things as well as good things. Yes. And in a situation like that, it's really could that be in scope of the regulator's responsibility? Potentially, yes, but it goes back to the point I make about the press. So the comments pages of newspapers, online newspapers, might be conceivably in scope, except for the fact that, in my view, they're covered by other forms of regulation. But in this case, I think there is not. If there's not that overlap, then I think it's certainly for us to consider, and for the regulator to consider, whether it's an area they want to move into. And I think, again, being as humble about this as I can, I don't think we know everything yet because this is genuinely new territory. So I think to some extent this has to develop organically, and when the regulator's in place, or even in shadow form starting to think about its upcoming responsibilities, that's when I think we'll be having exactly these kinds of conversations. And I'm open to them because I think it's important we do try to define exactly what the scope will be as it develops, and the world will change around us anyway. Yeah, great. Thank you. Giles Watling.
Yes, if I may just follow on to something that Julian Knight was talking about earlier. It's interesting that it's in the interest of social media and games companies to create an addictive spiral. Doubtless you know about that, and it's a thing I've got on the wall of my office to remind me. And we had a couple of young chaps before us who, one of whom had spent 32 hours straight playing a game.
Yes.
And this is some form of addiction. I just wondered, what is your department doing, Secretary of State, to address that issue?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say, of course, as you all recognise, Mr. Watling, is it's not just the games industry where this sort of design is suspected. So on my trip to the West Coast that was mentioned earlier, I met the man responsible for the Infinite Scroll, and he did have the decency to apologise. But there's clearly a question as to whether or not some of these technologies have been designed deliberately in order to keep you there. And of course, there's a broader question, which again we've touched on in the online harms white paper, around whether or not there's a business model here to keep you looking at negative things because you stay looking at it for longer than you spend looking at positive things, and we can sell you more ads. That's a question which I think we would want regulators and others to apply their minds to. So far as the games industry is concerned, again, I think it is a responsibility for the games industry not just to produce an entertaining product, though of course they try and do that, but also to think about what potential damage it can do, just as we expect toy manufacturers to do that. We expect manufacturers of all kinds to do that. The law of negligence in this country is well established. You have to start to think about what damage your product can do and design against it to the greatest extent that you can. I see no reason why the same rules don't and shouldn't apply to those who are developing gaming technologies too. As I say, I think for the reasons of manageability as much as anything else, we've made a distinction between user-generated content and professionally generated content for the purposes of the white paper, but that doesn't mean that we're not, and I say we collectively, obviously BEIS and other government departments have an interest in this too, in continuing to expect the highest product standards to be applied, which isn't just about producing a glittering product, but producing a safe one.
But beyond the white paper, my question really is, what is your department doing about the addiction side of it?
Yeah.
How are they proposing to address it?
Yeah, so I think two things. First of all, we are interested in the work that you are doing around establishing just how much of an issue this really is, because again, I think that if you're talking about addiction to particular pastimes, well, that goes way back past Angry Birds and before. We've all been addicted to one degree or another to some of these pastimes and entertainments. That's a very long-standing issue. The real question is design of addiction and the design of properties into your game that's deliberately there in order to perpetrate this kind of addiction. That's a different thing, and I think we're still getting to grips with how that might work. But again, my view is that the primary obligation on you as a manufacturer, as a designer, is to produce a safe product as well as one that is entertaining and not one that will damage those who use it. And so I think we're still in the foothills of understanding this, but it is a responsibility not just of my department, but of other parts of government, BEIS being the most obvious example. And you can argue, I think, the health department and education too, to take an interest in all of this, and we all are.
Is your department engaging with manufacturers?
Well, we do that all the time.
Yep.
And the conversations we have with the games industry is that balanced one I described earlier. Yes, we want you to succeed. Yes, we want you to do well, we want to support you to compete internationally, but we also want to make sure that you are acting responsibly towards those who use your products. That's the conversation we do have with them, and we'll continue.
Thank you. I want to move on now to what I was really going to ask you about, and that is Huawei. And of course, I don't want you to break any confidences, but you're probably aware that recently, well, at the beginning of last month, there was a report saying that there could be, if Huawei was in some way restricted in rolling out 5G in this country, there could be an 18 to 24-month delay, which would cost between 4.5 and 6.8 billion to the economy. Do you think it'll ruin the rollout of 5G if the government bans the use of Huawei equipment on 5G?
Okay, so I should start by saying what you'd expect me to say, which is that there is a limit beyond which I cannot go in discussing this subject, and that inevitably, I'm afraid, hampers the answers I'm going to give, which I apologise in advance. But let me talk about what I think some of the principles that are clear and are possible for me to set out, which will apply to this decision. The first thing to recognise, as the committee will know, is that there is already a substantial amount of Huawei equipment within the telecoms network. So we are not starting from a standing start. There is already Huawei equipment, and that applies to the telecoms network more broadly. It does not apply to critical national infrastructure from which Huawei equipment has been excluded for some time. It's also right, and the committee knows this, that there is a method of managing Huawei equipment which does not exist for other suppliers because of the nature of Huawei and where it comes from. That's the oversight mechanisms, the evaluation centre about which the committee knows. It is there for us to engage with Huawei and make sure we are confident in the equipment that it supplies. The conclusions of that oversight mechanism, most recently, the last 2 reports it's produced, have not been about concerns that the Huawei equipment in the system is being used for espionage, but rather that there are technical engineering deficiencies in it that need to be remedied. So this is not solely about espionage, it's really about quality of engineering so far in the Huawei equipment that's already within the system. We've then said, and I did this deliberately when I arrived in the job because I thought it needed doing, that what we actually have to do next is a properly based review of the security of the telecom supply chain, included but not limited to Huawei equipment. This is not a review that is just about Huawei, it's about all the equipment in the network. And it's worth recognising too that there is a substantial amount of Chinese componentry or Chinese assembly of componentry in the material that is supplied by other suppliers in the network. So this isn't just about Huawei. In other words, if you're asking the question, how do I exclude Chinese equipment from our network in its entirety, you would not only be looking at Huawei, because other manufacturers also include Chinese components in what they produce and supply to us.
So you've had no evidence or seen no evidence at all of possible espionage?
The judgment that's been made by the Oversight Board, and these reports are published so you can read them, is that the concern they have is not that Huawei equipment is being co-opted by the Chinese state for espionage purposes, but that there are engineering deficiencies in that equipment, which mean we should all be worried about it. And it may not be the Chinese that's manipulating that, it could even be others, but it's an engineering problem. That's the view of the oversight mechanism. Now, the review that I've initiated goes beyond that. It isn't just about Huawei equipment, and it isn't just about engineering deficiencies. It's a properly based review of the whole telecom supply chain, so that we can determine what we ought to do as a nation to keep our telecoms equipment safe. Why is that important? Well, it's important as things stand, but it becomes increasingly important as we move towards 5G. So 5G will enable us to do more things, more networks on more sensitive subjects and more sensitive purposes, which make this even more crucial. So this is the time to do it. That review is complete, but the decisions that government need to take on the back of it are not yet. And what leaks notwithstanding, I've tried to say is that as and when we're in a position to describe what we've decided to do and why we've decided to do it, then of course I will come to the House and I'll make a statement in the normal way.
Do you have
and
any idea of a
explain
time frame on that?
I can't give you a date. I hope not too long from now. But it's important that some of those starting points that I've described, some of the assumptions perhaps that people are making about how much Huawei equipment there is, how much there is in the core of the network, how much there is in critical national infrastructure, intelligence and security networks, defence networks, some of those assumptions are wrong. And the primary purpose of the review that I've set in train, and on which we will now make decisions, is not to find a way of cheapening the cost of a 5G network. It is to find a way of making sure that the 5G network and our broader telecoms infrastructure is safe, is secure. That's its primary purpose. So I will not trade off, and I'm sure neither will the Prime Minister, economic benefit with cheap kit from security risk. Won't do that. The primary purpose of this exercise is to find a way in which we can deliver a 5G network safely. But it's important also to say, finally, that there's a reason we're keen to deliver a 5G network. You know, for some people who would say, well, let's not bother that. It sounds like it's terribly risky. There's a real reason why we need 5G and why we need to be globally, or we should want, I think, to be globally competitive in 5G too. And when you want to do that, you have to take the market and the suppliers and the network of the equipment that exists as it is. Would we all like the supplier to be a British firm that we can all be absolutely confident in? Yes, of course. Does such a firm exist? No, I'm afraid it doesn't. And unless you want to create it from scratch, which will take a very long time, then we do not have that option available to us. So this, as ever, is not a perfect world, but we are seeking to make sure that whatever we do in the 5G supply network, we do it safely.
Do you envisage a serious hold-up in the rollout of 5G because of these issues that you've just described, which might indeed cost the economy many billions of pounds?
There is certainly the possibility of a delay in the process of the rollout of 5G. If you want to do 5G fastest, then you do that without any consideration for security. But we're not prepared to do that. So I don't exclude the possibility that there will be some delay. Of course, the way in which we approach this, based on security considerations, will determine how long the delay might be. The more you want to restrict this kind of material from the network, the longer the delay is going to be. That's the reality of it. But, as I've said, the primary intention of this process is to get the security of the network right. I will not sacrifice either the speed of delivery of the network or the cost of the delivery of the network for the security imperative. And I don't think the Prime Minister will. Well, I'm pretty sure the Prime Minister won't either. So that's the way we move through this. But these are not straightforward issues. They are not, you'd expect me to say, helped by people leaking selective information from discussions about them, and it is inevitably impossible for me to go into a great deal of detail about all the considerations and how they balance up because of the nature of the material we're talking about here.
Okay, I think you've about covered it. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Clive Efford.
The Australian government's decision for an outright ban on Huawei was that 5G networks will have less clear division between core and edge architecture.
Yeah.
So what assessment have you made of that issue?
Yeah, I mean, again, you'll understand, Mr. Efford, I can't disclose to you precisely the advice that we've had from those who advise us on the security of this. But for your reassurance, the review that's been conducted has been discussed and developed in parallel between my officials and those at the National Cybersecurity Centre. That's the advice that we take from our own experts about the security requirements here. Now, if we come to a view that is different from the Australian view of this, and every country must make its own judgments based on its own security advice and based crucially on the capacity it has to protect against the risks that are inherent to all of this. If we come to a different view to the Australians, then I will explain why we've done so. To the greatest extent I'll be able to with reference to security information, but I can give you this reassurance that we are developing this closely with those who work for NCSC and who are our experts on this, and you won't find me discounting the advice that they have given.
So the National Cybersecurity body that's been set up is paid for by Huawei.
No, sorry, I should be clear.
And it's there to vet.
No, there are two different bodies. So there is an oversight body that deals with our relationship with Huawei. That's a separate body. The National Cybersecurity Centre is not specifically there to deal with Huawei. It's a separate pre-existing body.
No, but the head of the National
Cybersecurity
Centre chairs the vetting
so
body.
There is absolutely. So there's NCSC high-level representation in that oversight body, and so that is a way of bringing together Huawei with our security infrastructure to make an assessment about Huawei equipment. But the advice that I'm talking about that will determine our judgments on this broader review, which again I repeat is not just about Huawei, it's about the entirety of the network from wherever the information is supplied. That advice comes from National Cybersecurity Centre. It doesn't come from Huawei. They're not involved in that process.
And how many other companies involved in this process were vetted in the same way?
So the process of looking at the telecoms infrastructure, which we're engaged in now, covers all suppliers. As it happens, within the network, and I'm talking about the radio access network predominantly here, there are remarkably few suppliers. So essentially Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson. And so we're not talking about a large number of companies. But there is ongoing engagement with all of them, as you'd expect, and there will continue to be. What I'm interested in doing is working out whether there's a methodology we can apply that, regardless of where we get our equipment from, we can be satisfied that the security requirements are being met. Now, inevitably, it'll make a difference whether you're dealing with a Chinese company with all of the restrictions there are on Chinese companies compared to one that isn't. But I suppose my point earlier was really to say I don't think we should lull ourselves into a false sense of security that says if we simply exclude Chinese companies, and of course we've done that. So if you look at ZTE, it's a Chinese company which we have said should not be supplying equipment into the network. That's the decision we've already taken. But even if you were to exclude all Chinese companies, you wouldn't be excluding all Chinese equipment, and you wouldn't, in my view, be adequately addressing the broader questions of security that we ought to apply our minds to for the whole telecoms network.
So the decision on moving forwards with Huawei is now to the exclusion of those other two companies, or they're still in. You could still switch to them if you weren't satisfied with your security arrangements.
So they each supply a percentage of the market, yes, at the moment. Inevitably, if what you do is you move from 3 suppliers all competing to 2 suppliers all competing, and it's worth saying also that in some of these installations, sometimes deliberately, there is equipment from more than one supplier, and that in itself has a security value. If you reduce the number of suppliers in the system, then inevitably you will lose economic benefit because the competition won't be as fierce, but there is also a security consequence to that because you will have fewer different suppliers within a network. So if you imagine for a moment that we reduced it not just to 2 suppliers but to 1, and then that supplier is taken over by a hostile foreign power, you have a problem because you only have 1 supplier in your system. So this is far from straightforward, and we, I think, have to think more broadly than just do we or do we not like this particular company or trust this particular company. Can we accommodate this kind of company in our system? I think we have to think more broadly than that about the security of the entire supply chain and how we impose the proper restrictions on all of it.
So when mobile operators are raising concerns about Huawei equipment, is it fair, or are there concerns about the other suppliers too, causing delay in the rollout of 5G?
I suspect you can probably find complaints about everyone's equipment at some point. As I say, the concerns we have about Huawei equipment are more visible because of the oversight process we have in place. Right. So reports are produced about it in a way that they're not produced about Ericsson or Nokia, for example. So I don't know the answer to what level of concern you would get from mobile network operators about equipment from them. What I do know is that when you look at what the oversight process has concluded about Huawei equipment, it is not, in their judgment, that this is material which is being exploited for espionage purposes. It's problems with the engineering. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that we can exclude either the fact, and it is a fact, that Chinese companies are biddable by the Chinese state in a way that Nokia and Ericsson are not. So that is a factor, and I don't want to dismiss it, but that's not actually where the focus of concern so far has been in the particular oversight mechanism that we've had in place for Huawei and for some time.
Okay. Just finally, I mean, there were a lot of concerns expressed coming back, over a decade about Huawei's involvement in networks across the world, including countries with whom we are very friendly and cooperate with on security issues, which makes it all the more surprising that we've taken the decision we have. Were there any other factors that were at play, like wanting to have close relationships with China following Brexit or anything like that?
No. Is the straight answer to that. I've set out what are the parameters of the review from my point of view and the basis on which we'll seek to take decisions. It's worth saying, as I said earlier on, we haven't taken decisions yet, so there's been no exclusion yet. It's also worth saying that when you look around the world, what you'll find is a good deal of Huawei equipment in many other countries too, and they are going through very similar processes to us. So they are making judgments about what they should do, not just about the Huawei equipment that's already in their system, but about how much involvement they should allow this company in the development of their own 5G networks. Now, it is perfectly true, as you say, that Australia has come to a particular conclusion, which is that they wish to exclude from the 5G network all equipment that may be biddable by another state. That's essentially the definition they've given it. That's not yet a conclusion that anyone else has come to. And we'll have to see what everyone else decides. Our primary responsibility, of course, is to decide what we think is best for the UK. And I've tried to set out to the detail, as you accept I can go into, the basis for those decisions here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to clarify a few things on this, it would be fair to say that the advice that's been given about Huawei is that its involvement in our infrastructure here poses national security risks now and will continue to do so in the future.
Well, I'm not, as you will understand, Mr. Chairman, going to go into precisely what the security advice we've been given has been. What I've said, and I'm happy to repeat, is that there is clearly Huawei equipment within the system. We have a mechanism for managing it. That's public knowledge, and you can read the reports of how that oversight mechanism operates and makes its assessments. Our judgment now has to be, based on the level of involvement there is in Huawei in a system that we operate now, do we intend to say we will have no further involvement of Huawei in the 5G network, which of course, as the committee appreciates, is built on top of the 4G network. You don't start from scratch for that either. Or do you say we're content to allow them to participate in all parts of that 5G network? Do you say only in some parts? Do you say we're unprepared to tolerate Huawei equipment in any of our network, which would mean ripping out quite a bit of equipment from our existing telecoms network? Those are the judgments we've got to decide between. Yeah. We do that on the basis of security advice, and I can't disclose that to you, but the committee has my reassurance that we will not be ignoring that advice in the decisions that we make.
So the report of the Oversight Board, the Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre Oversight Board that you've mentioned, so that says that the Oversight Board can only provide limited assurance that all risks to UK national security from Huawei's involvement in the UK's critical networks can be sufficiently mitigated long term.
Yes.
So not only are there issues now, but they can't provide any guarantee that they'll be resolved in the long term as well.
That's right, and that's based, as I said, on engineering deficiencies within Huawei equipment. And of course, this is cumulative. So if you produce a report 1 year to say, we think there are engineering deficiencies in Huawei equipment, and Huawei says, oh yes, well, we'll do something about that. You then produce a following year's report which says they're still there, then your level of confidence must diminish. That I think is right. But just to finish the thought, but that is based on the assessment of the oversight mechanism about engineering quality. It is not based, as I read it, on assumptions around espionage or the co-option of Huawei by the Chinese state.
But the Oversight Board is saying that these technical deficiencies, as you call them, are a risk to national security.
Well, I think
that's what it says in the report.
Yes, I think the point is that if you have engineering deficiencies of this kind in a telecoms network, then whether or not the Chinese state is looking to use Huawei equipment to access the network, there's a risk that others might. I think is the point they're seeking to make.
Yes, but there's something else concerning about it. It's not just that they're saying this is a UK national security threat. It's that they're also saying that Huawei are not fixing these technical deficencies.
Certainly not adequately. Certainly not between those two reports.
If I may, the report goes further. The Oversight Board can only provide... I'll quote exactly from what the report says. It said that for this reason, the National Cybersecurity Centre continues to advise the Oversight Board that the National Cybersecurity Centre, can only provide... It's only appropriate to provide limited technical assurance in the security risk management possible for equipment currently deployed in the UK, since the NCSC has not yet seen a credible remediation plan.
Right.
So what they're saying is they're not seeing any credible plan for Huawei to fix these technical difficulties that pose a threat to national security. In that situation, is it not fair to say, is this a company we should be giving more work to until they've fixed the national security risks in the network they've already built?
Well, it's undoubtedly a relevant consideration. And again, I'm a little bit hamstrung by not being able to go into a great deal of detail as to what advice we're getting from NCSC. But as we were discussing, Mr. Efford and I, there is a clear high-level involvement by NCSC in the oversight mechanism for Huawei. So the people who are advising us on these broader decisions are intimately concerned and aware of what's going on in the Huawei oversight mechanism. So the people who are writing those reports, certainly contributing substantially to them, are the ones who are going to be advising us about the broader principles that should apply here. So you can rest assured that their judgments on Huawei that they've managed to gain via those oversight mechanisms will play a part, I have no doubt, in the broader advice they give us, and I shall be listening very carefully to that advice.
But you can see that boiling this down, the official advice is that's public. I mean, this is the public advice. This is what's been published by the Cabinet Office, let alone what the private advice is like. That these technical deficiencies are a national security risk. Huawei are aware of them. They're not fixing them. Yeah. And whilst those risks exist, they could be exploited by anybody.
Yes,
including the Chinese.
Yes, but as I say, the level of risk in this process exists. We know it. We know what it is. The real question is, are you able to mitigate and manage that risk substantially enough to be confident that for the 5G contracts we're talking about next, we should consider Huawei for them? Yeah. That's the question. Now, again, I'm in difficulty because I can't tell you what we're being advised, but you can assume that what you've read out to me is part of the advice that we're being given. Yeah. It's not the totality of the advice we're being given. And our judgment has to be, can we manage and mitigate that risk successfully? That's the primary consideration. If the answer to that is no, then you can assume that we will proceed in the same way as the Australians have and say Huawei should not be within the system. If the answer is yes, we may come to a different conclusion. But that's the basis for decision making. That's what we're doing at the moment.
But you have to say, unless Huawei is going to start doing something different, the answer to that question would have to be no.
No, I don't think that's right.
Well, if I may, because what the reports are saying is the risks are there and they're not going away. Now, if they were to say, well, actually, we are working on resolving them and with confidence we can do that, that'll be one thing. But what they're saying is the risks are there and they're not going away.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think there's any starry-eyedness in the minds of NCSC about Huawei, far from it. And there are certain risks that aren't going to go away. The Chinese are not going to change their law so that Chinese companies are no longer biddable by the Chinese state. That's an ongoing risk. The trick here is to find out whether we think we can hedge these risks around sufficiently that they are risks that are manageable. Now, we have to take those judgments on the basis of the advice we get. Some of that advice is public. You've read it out to me. Some of it is not, and at least as far as I'm concerned, will not become public. And so it is difficult for me to have a comprehensive discussion about it. It will be a little easier, I think, when we've reached those conclusions, we set them out in the normal way in a statement. The committee will, I know, pay close attention to that and want to question me further on it when we do that. But I hope what's helpful today is for me to set out the parameters for the decision-making. That's how we will approach it. And as I say, the committee has my reassurance this is not an exercise in working out how we get the cheapest telecoms equipment. No, it's about much more than that.
I appreciate that, and you've made that very clear. Just final question for me on this is that, given the advice that's been given so far, given what's in the public reports about this, you say the question is, do we feel we can manage that risk responsibly in the future? Yeah. Do you think we've been successful at managing that risk so far?
Well, clearly, we would like to have been more successful, because if you look at the movement from year 1 to year 2, it hasn't been anything like as great an improvement as we would have wished. But I don't think it follows from that, that serious though all those concerns are, it automatically means that we have no faith in Huawei to improve their equipment in the ways that we would expect. So it is more complicated than that. As perhaps you would expect. But I think there is no doubt that what's causing us considerable pause is the fact that those concerns clearly exist.
Thank you. Rebecca Powell.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move us on to a different subject. And thank you for attending, Secretary of State. Mobile coverage, in particular. So the government had very much set its heart on, obviously, this being a key priority, and through the auctions, achieving 95% coverage. But Ofcom have actually reduced that coverage commitment, saying that under the auction they're reducing it to 90% and actually going to take even will take even longer to deliver it, not the 3 years for the coverage, but up to 4 years.
Yeah.
So I just wondered, what is your response really in terms of now setting out a clear plan, saying how on earth we are going to reach our targets and up our game on mobile coverage? Because
Yes.
I've got to be honest and say, I'm sure lots of us go about, and I get absolutely constant comments about our poor mobile coverage in this country.
Yes, I do too, and suffer from it as everyone else here does. And the 95% aspiration remains. That is what I think we should try to get to. I am less prescriptive about the means by which we achieve it. Now, it may be that we can get some or all of the way through the Ofcom auction process for that section of spectrum. But my view, and I've expressed this, I think, with breathtaking clarity to the industry, is that I want 95% coverage. If they believe that it can't be done by means of the auction process, then they need to come to me with proposals as to how it can be done. And I am not prepared to take off the table means by which we can contribute to that target, which they may not very much like. They do not like the concept of rural roaming. They don't like the idea of being compelled to share masts. And I understand why. Their concern is that if you take the time and trouble to invest in a network of masts and then the government makes you share them, you haven't gained the maximum return from your investment. I understand that. That's a rational response.
Would the government be putting money into that, though? So to make it more acceptable, obviously there's got to be carrots.
Yes, I accept that. Can I come on to that?
Yes.
Just to finish the thought, though, in relation to roaming, one way in which we may be able to improve coverage is to expect mobile network operators to share structures, so that even if it's not your mobile network operator that's got the nearest mast, you can still make use of it. That, I think, will have an effect. Predictably, it will. Now, there may be a mechanism whereby the mobile network operator whose mast it is can charge the others for its use. That's all perfectly feasible. But even that may not do the whole job. Now, I want to see what the industry comes back to me with. In my view, the ball is in their court. I've said to them, I will consider mobile roaming, among other things, if I believe it's what's necessary to get to me to my 95% goal. If you can find a way of doing it that doesn't involve that, because you don't want to do that, let me hear what it is. If they come back with something that says, OK, we can do this, but it's going to cost you some money, you, the taxpayer, are going to have to stump up some cash, then I will, of course, consider that. What I want to do is to provide the level of service that your constituents expect, and so do mine. We will have to consider what the industry comes back with, and I don't want to prejudge it. I want them to have the opportunity to present me with a proposal. They're going to do that very shortly, and when they do, I'll make an assessment of it. But I want to be sure that we are making the best use of the network and we're getting the closest we can to 95%. By whatever means will be most effective at doing it.
Have you got any dates then for this? Because if you happen to be running a business, and I particularly want some reference to the rural areas, this is urgent. They don't want to keep on waiting. Counties like Somerset, for example, are really badly hit.
Yes.
A third of buildings in rural areas can't get any mobile coverage.
Yes.
I mean, this is really serious.
Yes, it is, and we need to get on with this. That's certainly true. The commitment that we have is to do that by 2022. But of course, there's no reason why we can't see improvements along the way. And there should be consistent improvements along the way, and we shouldn't, I think, be too definitive about the technologies we use either. So let us see what other particular technological solutions there might be, and as we move towards 5G, there are other options available to us too, particularly in rural areas. Small cell 5G networks, based, for example, with hubs in farms, are a promising way in which we can start to deliver better service to rural areas, including in Somerset. So there are possible technologies available to us. As I say, From a ministerial point of view, I am agnostic about the technology. What I'm after is the result. And the result must be that we get to 95% coverage. Inevitably, as everybody here knows, the closer to that target you get, the harder it becomes, because the remaining few percentage are the really hard to reach places. But that doesn't make it any less important that we get there, and I believe we should. So the next step is for the industry to come to me and say if they don't like the methods that I've currently got available to me, they are obligated to present me with alternatives. That's what they are going to do.
And how ruthless will you be in terms of rapidly reading the Riot Act and saying that's not good enough? You haven't come up with some ideas, because basically you put the ball in their court.
Yeah.
Saying this isn't good enough, you have to do it by this date. And
it's been the way that I think it should be done. And I will then revert to pursuing options like rural roaming, which I believe can do it more effectively. So you're right, the ball is in their court, but I don't intend to leave it there for long. It's up to them to come forward with proposals.
And you mentioned perhaps we might use 5G, but that all depends on the Huawei you were issuing. All that. So do you think you're pushing more for 4G? Is that more realistic?
Well, 4G is what we're working on now.
Yeah.
There will be some 5G rollout later this year, I think it'll begin.
Because
so
you haven't put it down in your draft statement of strategic priorities. You haven't actually specified, I don't think, what it should be.
No, and I don't think it's right to. I think, as I say, it's the objective that's crucial. It's not the technology. I'm open to suggestion as to the most effective way and the quickest way we can get to our 95% target. Because I don't think people you represent or the people I represent could really care less which technology it is. They just want it to work. So let's find out how we can most effectively get to a place where it works in the most number of places across the country. That's the objective. So in the end, there are a number of potential tools available to me. They include the Ofcom auction, though it's worth saying, of course, that the Ofcom auction is a matter for Ofcom, not for me, but it's a way of getting some way towards the destination. Roaming is another possibility. It's not without its problems, as we know, but it's an option to consider. There may well be others. And what I'm expecting of the industry is that they come forward with their proposals as to how we deliver that target. Once I've seen it, I can make my assessment of it. If I don't think it's good enough, you have my assurance I'll tell them so and send them back again. But we must get to a place where we've got a series of options, probably, that will get us towards that target. That's what we're all after. I'm agnostic about methods.
One thing that I'm very conscious of, are you aware that we exacerbate this rural-urban divide and what I would call a great deal of rural deprivation because we haven't sorted out things like mobile coverage in the rural areas?
Yes.
And for a government, I think this is something, would you say, that you've got to take on board rather more seriously than we have been?
Well, I'm very clearly aware of that, and I hope you'll see that in the approach we've taken on broadband, because the approach we've taken to broadband is to say two things. First of all, everybody deserves the best possible quality of broadband supply. That comes from fibre. It doesn't come from copper wire anymore. And if we're going to deliver a fibre network to the maximum extent we can, we should not allow those places that were left till last in the superfast rollout to be left until last in the fibre rollout. That's why what we've said in the future telecoms infrastructure review is that we would take a so-called outside-in approach. What that really means is that we identify the places, like the ones you represent, quite a few of the ones I represent, that will not get a market rollout of good quality broadband without some help, identify those early and give them the broadband coverage they ought to have to a high standard at the same time in parallel with the market rollout. That's exactly why we want to do that differently to the way in which it was done in the superfast rollout, precisely for the reasons you give. So that is exactly the policy approach that we've reflected on broadband. Mobile, as I say, the objective is to get to those hard-to-reach last places. I'm agnostic on method. I think there'll be a number of possible technical solutions and probably a combination of them. And I hope very shortly to have the industry's proposals as to how we do that.
We have strayed onto broadband, and I'm not going to ask, I think someone else is asking about that, but I must just ask you about connecting Devon and Somerset and other areas, I think, where GigaClear were operating. They still have not delivered. When will come a time where you as Secretary of State might intervene to to get on with this programme, because yet again, it's largely the rural areas who are suffering. They've been given the contract. It's the biggest contract in the country. Hasn't been delivered. It's all stalled. People are up in arms about this. So can you? We extended the state aid, for which we're extremely grateful, pending the autumn statement. What is going to happen?
Yes. Well, as you know, I'm aware of the particular concerns in the area you represent, Mrs. Powell, not least because you've drawn my attention to them on a number of occasions. I think it's fair to say on behalf of GigaClear, I don't believe that their performance has been inadequate everywhere. I think there are examples of good performance in other places, and GigaClear are one of those few operators that focus specifically on rural areas, and important that we have operators that do. But I think the right thing for me to do is to pick up again the specifics of your concerns, and perhaps we can deal with that by separate correspondence, so that if there are further points for me to pick up, I can do that. It isn't acceptable for companies, whoever they are, not to meet their contractual obligations here, and if that's not happening, then I'm happy to pick it up elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Chair. The story on mobile coverage across the UK hasn't been, it's not a story to be particularly proud of, and those living, working, representing or trying to do business across the UK in the rural areas will testify to that. But neither has the rollout of full fibre broadband. What percentage today, what percentage of UK homes and businesses currently have access to full fibre broadband?
So the figure at the moment on full fibre is about 7%, I believe, and I would entirely agree that that is inadequate. It's inadequate for our own purposes, and it's inadequate by reference to some of our competitors. Not all, but some. There are countries in Europe that have a much more substantial percentage of fibre rollout than that. So we have to do better than that. We've talked a little bit about already the outside-in approach, which for me is a better way of delivering fibre broadband to as much of the UK as we possibly can. You can expect, I think, the market, and increasingly you're starting to see this, to produce good quality fibre coverage for urban areas. So if you live in the middle of Birmingham or in the middle of London or in the middle of Manchester, you're going to find a number of different operators competing to lay fibre which will supply your needs. The difficulty is in the areas you represent, that Mrs. Powell represents, that largely I represent, where you're not going to get different fibre providers competing to lay fibre to your constituents' doorsteps, because they are more difficult areas to reach. So we have to have a strategy that enables us to deal with that 10% or so, as we assess it to be, that the market will simply not reach without extra help. That's what the outside-in approach is for. That's what the Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review does. Now, I had to make a substantive and strategic decision very early on in my time in this job, where I could either have said, we will go on as taxpayers subsidised towards full fibre. Now, what that means is that it may take a little longer for some people to get their upgrade, because delivering them a part copper, part fibre upgrade would be quicker than delivering them a full fibre upgrade, but it's a lot better, the upgrade you get on full fibre, than the one you get by combination. So, with one slight caveat for that built-in slight delay, I still believe that the objective here is to roll fibre out as fast as we can, and to do it for as much of the UK as we can, not just for the major urban areas.
Okay, you referenced other European countries, and to give it some context, that the figure of 7% was what I had read. I just wanted to confirm.
Thank heavens for that.
Spain are currently over 70%.
Yes.
Portugal are currently over 90%.
Yes,
so
that's right.
How on earth does the United Kingdom got itself into the position of having a 7% rollout?
Well, there are a number of reasons for it. If you look at the combination of multi-occupancy dwellings, which are easier to connect if you have the right planning laws, because you put in the feed and then you go into all the flats in the building. There is a different ratio between Spain and Portugal and the UK. Our planning laws are not quite where we want them to be, and we've talked already about potential legislation on way leaves to allow for services to be connected where the landlord hasn't responded to the requests from the fibre supplier to do so. So there are a number of legislative measures that we can take, But I wouldn't dispute, Mr. O'Hara, that we are not in the place we want to be. We need to go faster than this, and that's exactly why we're doing what we're doing, making a strategic decision to focus on fibre, changing the planning laws so that we can roll it out as fast as possible to multi-occupancy dwellings, which will start to get you a significantly higher percentage, but also making sure that we don't lose sight of the need to give good quality access, if not by fibre, perhaps by other technologies, but to good quality broadband to people who live wherever they live in the UK, because these are not going to be optional extras. They are already and are going to increasingly be utilities that everybody needs.
Well, you see the problems with, or the advantage of multiple occupancy, etc. But I've just come back from the Faroe Islands quite recently. A small, far northern group of islands, no multiple occupancy, very, very limited multiple occupancy. They have a far more difficult geography or topography than almost anywhere else in the United Kingdom. But they are absolutely miles ahead of the UK. So ultimately, this has been the fault of politics. It's a political failure to do this. Had the political will been there, then there is no geography, topography or multiple occupancy which you could point to say that's the reason it hasn't been done.
Well, I don't accept there's a lack of political will. There is considerable political will.
There has been.
Well, I speak for the department I operate now, and there is no lack of will to deliver this. And I hope you're right that there will be considerable support for the legislative measures we think can help. I look forward to the support of the SNP, and I hope all other parties for the legislation will bring forward on Whaleys, because I think that will make a difference. But in the end, this is about marshalling our resources to deliver this improvement as fast as we can. That's what we're doing. 7% is a low base. Now, I think you can see, and if you looked at a graph, what you'd find, I think, is accelerating progress, because we're starting to see the laying of fibre not just by Openreach but by Virgin and by others, and we've talked already about some of the other operators, the altnets that are operating in rural areas like GigaClear or Hyperoptic and others that are operating in urban areas. So we're starting to see a lot more activity. That's what we want. And my objective is to support that activity in the best way that I can, and to remove any legislative obstacles that there might be to that happening further. Something else we have to do, by the way, and which we are doing in conjunction with others in government, is to make sure that new builds have fibre connections. You should not be building houses in 2019 that don't have a full fibre connection. And so we expect the builders of new housing estates to be working closely with Openreach to make sure that those connections are put in from the outset. Once that starts to happen at scale, you'll start to see considerable movement in that percentage figure.
Are you concerned, or has anything been done about the sort of doubling up of effort as Openreach and AN Other, both head for the jam of central Edinburgh or central Birmingham, and they're all chucking in hundreds, millions of pounds each, doubling up an effort to try and maximise profit, whereas, as we say, rural parts of the UK are being completely ignored. Has there anything been done to stop that, or to?
Yeah, I think there's. I take the point. I think it's a challenge here. I think we should be realistic about the degree to which we can combat it. The reality is that the reason everybody gravitates towards central Manchester or Edinburgh or London or anywhere else is that there are a lot of customers there, all within a relatively short space of each other. So laying the infrastructure and servicing those customers is easier, cheaper, and more lucrative. That we can't change. The reality is, out in the countryside, those economic dynamics don't apply in the same way. What we can, however, do is two things. First of all, make sure that the ducts and poles, the architecture that at the moment Openreach control, is open up to everybody so that people can make use of it to deliver their service more cheaply and effectively, and we're doing that. The second thing we can do is make sure that Openreach, which are still, of course, the dominant operators in this marketplace, are more transparent about what they're doing and where they're going, so that we don't have unnecessary duplication. I'm all in favour of competition, but I want to avoid unnecessary duplication. Part of that will be, if you are an alternative supplier to Openreach, having a better sense of where Openreach is going. So some of that is about transparency, and we're looking at ways in which we can do more of that too.
Okay. Will Brexit have an effect on the fibre rollout?
Well, I think the imperative to deliver a good quality fibre network will remain, whatever our status with the European Union. These are utilities that, whatever our associations internationally will be, we will want and we will need. So the potential effect, which you might be coming to, is the workforce implications. So if you're going to deliver a network at pace, you need properly qualified and skilled people to do it. Now, in that context, it is true, and of course the fact that Spain and Portugal, for example, have very extensive fibre networks indicates to you that there are quite a lot of Spanish and Portuguese people with the skills to deliver that kind of rollout, because they've done it in their own country. So if your question to me is, are we, as a matter of Brexit, inevitably going to see the choking off of the labour, the skilled labour that we need? I don't think that is inevitable. What it relies upon, though, is an intelligent design of our immigration system. Now, one of the advantages of Brexit is that we have the chance to design our immigration system in the way that we think will benefit us most substantially. And I think one of the ways in which we should do so is to recognise that there are some skill sets that we will want, some individuals that we will want to encourage to come here and facilitate their access. I expect and hope that that's exactly what the Home Office designed new immigration system will be, and you can be assured that what my department is doing is speaking to the Home Office about exactly how we can make sure that groups such as these are included in the Home Office's considerations in doing that.
Yeah. And I think every department has one, and wouldn't it just be far simpler if we just stayed either in the EU or within the single market? It would be life far simpler, because there are estimates that almost above 50% of the people who are digging the trenches and laying the fibre cable are EU nationals. It's a huge percentage, and that's not going to be picked up. And you know, do they qualify as earning more than £30,000 a year? Probably not. So it's a huge logistical challenge.
Right.
To what we're trying to achieve.
I mean, there are a few things in that. I mean, I won't, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure you want me to get distracted into the argument about whether or not we should accept the result of the referendum, which, by the way, I think we should. But if you're asking me about the design of our immigration system, the proposals the Home Office are making at the moment is, as you say, that we should gravitate towards welcoming those with high skills rather than those with low skills. High skills, one way of defining that is to say, do you make more than £30,000 or not? I don't offhand know whether the types of engineers and workers that we're discussing here would be above or below that threshold. But the other way that the Home Office are considering this is to look at shortage occupations. In other words, where do you not have those domestically grown skills and therefore need to find them elsewhere? I simply don't accept it's beyond our wit to design an immigration system that will enable people to come in from wherever, perhaps from the EU, perhaps from elsewhere, who have those skills to do the work we will have for them to do in order to deliver the network that we need. I just don't accept we can't do that, whether we are members of the European Union or not. It requires an approach that designs our own immigration system in an intelligent way. I think we're more than capable of doing that.
I would suggest we already have it by being members of the European Union, and we can keep it at least by retaining single market membership. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Joe Stevens.
Thank you, Chair. Can I follow on a bit to do with Brexit? How many of your civil servants are currently working on Brexit?
So, always difficult to give that figure because inevitably there are overlaps between some of the things that other bits of the department do and Brexit-related activity. If you're asking me about movements of staff solely to deal particularly with no-deal Brexit, because of course Brexit may be deal, it may be no deal, and both have
Brexit
consequences.
Generally.
Brexit generally is, as I say, quite hard to work out because quite a lot of what my department does is affected by the process of leaving the European Union, so they can carry on doing what they're doing while also acting on Brexit. But let me just give you some figures for no-deal planning, because we've done some of that. So a little over 100 of my civil servants transferred from the directorates they were in to do specifically no-deal planning. A large proportion of that, as the committee would expect, was to do with data adequacy, something that my department has been concerned about. In other words, how you make sure that data continues to flow between the UK and the EU, particularly in the event of a no-deal scenario.
And that 100, what proportion of your overall civil servant number
So
does that represent?
there are about 1,100 civil servants in DCMS altogether. What I was going to go on to say is that most of those 100 are now back to the desks they were in, so they've come back from that process. We need to make sure that they're able to go back to it if they need to, but most of them are back to their previous directorates. There were probably 80 or so who stayed in their original directorates but changed the nature of what they did, and there were some 20 civil servants seconded from outside the department. That's on the no-deal scenario. As I say, much harder to calculate for the deal scenario because quite a lot of the ongoing work of the department would need to be done anyway in a deal scenario, and of course you would have longer over which to do it. But I would say the majority of those who've shifted have shifted either into what we've called the Departmental Operations Centre, which is the way of dealing with any urgent requirements, or into data adequacy. Most of those, as I say, have come back to where they came from.
Okay. And if that cohort of your civil servants had not been pushed to deal with no deal and were not doing the other general Brexit stuff, would this online harms paper have come out much earlier?
No, because I've been very clear with the department throughout that I regarded the online harms white paper as a priority, and I wanted to make sure it had the resource it needed. The reason it's taken time, as I've discussed with the committee before, is that I've been absolutely determined to get it right. And I think it's important when you do something like this to take the time to listen to what people have to say. That applies to people in the House of Commons, people in the House of Lords, people outside. We've done a lot of that. And because of its novel nature as well as its complex nature, it's taken a while to do that. And I'll make no apologies for taking the time to make sure post the production of the white paper we get the responses understood before we produce legislation. So it's not about resource, it's about complexity and wanting to hear what people have to say. There are, of course, areas of departmental activity that have had less focus because people have gone to prepare for a potential no-deal scenario. I think that was the right thing to do. I don't think this committee would have been impressed and would have had different criticisms for me if we'd ended up in a no-deal scenario and the department was not prepared for it. So it was necessary to do that, but we will obviously want to make sure we redeploy resource back to that work as soon as possible.
Earlier in your evidence you said that the need for legislation is now urgent, and you said that you couldn't say when the next parliamentary session would start, and you couldn't answer the questions in terms of timelines that the chair asked you about a bill and producing legislation. So,
as you would accept, that's because those are not decisions within my control.
No, but it rather leaves a big gap for us in terms of what we understand about what your intentions are and when you're going to be able to deliver them.
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I think you know what my intentions are. My intention is to make sure that we proceed deliberatively as we have so far. And again, I make no apologies for that. I think that's exactly the way to do this, not just because we need to deliver good and effective UK legislation, but we also need to discuss this with colleagues around the world. It is not just the UK that's concerned about issues of internet safety, and it's not just the UK that needs to act on them. It's very much in our interests that we take the time and trouble to explain the approach that we're taking in the hope that others will take a similar approach. That's the way in which you deal with the concerns some will express about online companies simply forum shopping for the best place to get the least regulation. There's a way of avoiding that, and that's to make sure that other countries are acting too. So all of that takes a bit of...
though, aren't they? So France and Germany have already produced
in elements. What I think is different about our approach is the holistic nature of it. So you'll be able to find elements of what we are doing in a number of other countries. Australia has a regulator. Germany has the particular law that deals with illegal material and how quickly it comes down. You can certainly find that. What I would argue you can't find is the same holistic approach that we're proposing to take. So my point simply on timing is that we will want in this process to have international discussions as well as national discussions. So that's part of my intention. And as you rightly say, I've also said that I think this is urgent. I think it's important to get on with it. And that's why I've bid for a second session legislative slot. I can't tell you when that session begins. That's not a decision to be made by me as Secretary of State for DCMS. Neither is it open to me to insist with the business managers that I get a particular slot for a particular phase of that session. But It is my priority, it has been from the outset, to deliver this reform, and I think that the longer we wait, unless we are filling that time with productive activity, the longer it is before we start to address the online harms I think everybody in this room is keen to address. Those are my intentions. What I can't tell you is exactly what date this bill will come forward, because that's not a decision I can make.
But there is a risk, isn't there, the longer it goes on, bearing in mind the churn of ministers in your department since 2016, that you may not be around in the department to deliver it.
Well, there's always that risk, and I don't think any minister has a guarantee that they'll be around for any particular length of time. The best you can do is make good use of the time you've got. Now, I think the first and important milestone was to get the white paper out. I think the white paper sets a clear direction of travel. And as I've said, when we produce a piece of legislation, you will see within it the duty of care and the regulator. Now, I think those are the absolutely vital keystone components of this architecture. Now, to the extent that I can only say, well, for as long as I'm going to be here, I'm going to carry on developing this policy in a way that I think will make it most effective. I hope you would accept that my approach to it has been as collaborative as I can make it. I've done that with your front bench, I've done it with other front benches, and I've done it with this committee and a much broader selection of members of this House and the other place. And I will continue to do that because I think it's the right way of designing a policy of this significance. I cannot promise you that I will be here to see it through to the end. That's not my choice either. But for as long as I am here, that's the approach I'm going to take.
Okay. Turning to something different, Copyright Directive, which has recently been approved. I hope it's going to bring fairness to the online music market so that music creators, who I think get some, is it 0.00054 pence per music track through services like Google's YouTube. It's designed to be fair. What reassurance can you give us on the committee that irrespective of the Brexit outcome, it will be fully implemented so that we can build on our world-leading music industry? Yeah,
so as you know, the UK government supported the progress of this directive, and it wasn't entirely uncontroversial. And as you know, all of the music industry doesn't take the same view about this. So it wasn't entirely obvious what the UK government should do, but for the reasons you give, it seemed to us right to support this directive so that those who are producing content are properly rewarded for it, and that's increasingly important in the online world we've been discussing this afternoon. Now, of course, it's got to go through some further stages before this directive is finally finalised, and then, of course, it has to be implemented, and no European directive, as you know, happens overnight. It has a period of time for implementation. We don't, of course, yet have certainty as to our own timetable of departure from the EU. But what I think you can take from what we've done so far is that we believe the principle of this directive is the right one, and we will seek to implement that principle in domestic law. What I can't give you is an absolute guarantee that however this directive ends up, when it has finished its progress, we will implement it lock, stock and barrel, because we don't, I think, yet know exactly how it will resolve itself. But the principle seems to us to be the right one, hence our support for it throughout, and we will continue to support that principle.
Good, okay. Business rates. The retail discount scheme for business rates, which the government introduced, has received exponential increases in the rates in recent years. Grassroots music venues are obviously our talent pipeline for the music industry, but they've received an average of 31% increases in payable business rates since revaluation in 2017. I know that the government wrote to UK Music at the end of last year, but that contradicts the advice and the guidance for the relief, which says that music venues aren't similar in nature to eligible businesses, so the scheme won't apply to them. So do you think the guidance should be revised?
So I'm having a look at this in conjunction with my colleague, the Secretary of State for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, because, of course, substantially this is his policy area too. What I think has happened so far, as you say, is that the Treasury guidance has been that you shouldn't assume that music venues are comparable in nature to the venues for which these particular assistances were intended. That doesn't mean we don't think that help should be made available. In the end, as you rightly say, it's a matter of judgment for the local authority as to whether or not they choose to exercise their discretion. What we're having a look at is what other ways we might be of assistance, because I entirely accept that there is a problem here, that particular music venues are suffering very considerable increases, and I'm aware, and you will be, of venues which have seen something like 600% increases. Yeah. So they're very substantial. We stand supported in other ways too. So the Arts Council in particular does occasionally receive applications from small-scale music venues. No reason why they shouldn't. They don't receive a great number, I have to say, and it may well be because those sorts of venues don't think that's the kind of thing they could do. So there's probably something we can look at with the Arts Council as to how we make more visible the other routes for funding that they might be able to seek.
Okay. And finally, I think you mentioned earlier that you'd got an apology from the inventor of the infinite scroll. Yeah. So when you met Mark Zuckerberg, did you get any sort of apology from him for the failings of Facebook?
Well, look, I think what he recognises, and I think he produced something in print not long after to confirm this, is that just as we've been saying the era of self-regulation is over and government will need to take action, that is something that he accepts. And so I found that encouraging. As I said at the beginning, I didn't find it sufficient. And it won't mean, for me at least, that we say, well, in that case, we can leave you to get on with it and not worry terribly much about a legislative framework. There needs to be a legislative framework. Where I think we have to continually apply pressure is to get companies like Facebook to accept that despite all the aspirations, all the ideology, all the idealism that these companies began with, some of what they do is having a negative effect. And they have a responsibility to deal with that. So I found an openness to discussing with us how we design a system that will do that. But I made it very clear to him that this was not going to be co-regulation. It was not going to be a decision for he and I jointly to make about how the UK decides to regulate this space. It's our judgment as to how we best regulate, with which we will expect those who want to participate in the UK market and supply services to UK customers to comply. And I think he accepted that. And before you asked me, Mr. Chairman, I did indeed suggest to him that he ought to appear before this committee.
And do you think you can trust him to deliver that?
Well, we'll see. As I say, I don't intend to rely on assurances from the social media companies, not just Facebook, but all the others too. I intend to put before this House legislation that will give us assurance that the right restrictions are in place. And we'll talk as we process the legislation about whether they are the right restrictions or not. And you can guarantee, I'm sure, the social media companies will have something to say about whether they think these are properly judged restrictions or not. But we're legislators. We make our own judgments. And I made it clear to Mark Zuckerberg, to Facebook, and to the other social media companies that I met that I'm interested in their point of view, and it would be foolish, I think, for me as the relevant Secretary of State not to listen to what they have to say, but that in the end, the judgment as to what legislation to bring forward is mine, and the judgment as to which legislation to pass is that of Parliament. And that's what we intend to do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, I want to move on to women in sports governance.
Yes.
Completely different topic.
Yeah.
So in April 2017, Sport England introduced a new code of governance that committed organisations in receipt of public funding to a minimum of 30% of each gender represented on its board.
Yeah.
It was, the intention was to try and move towards an equal representation. Yes. And in a letter to committee in November 17, the Chief Exec of UK Sport and Sport England referred to sanctions being given to non-compliance, leading to possible withdrawing of public funding. Are you aware of any of those implementation plans having to be done?
No. My understanding is that of the, I think it's 58, might be 56, you'll have to forgive me, national governing bodies that are covered by the governance provisions that you're describing, they are all now compliant with our expectations. So they are all compliant, including the expectation that 30% of the board be, well, let's put it this way, the board has at least 30% of its component parts being of the opposite gender. That's my understanding, that they are all compliant. Those are not the only expectations, as you know. There are other requirements under that governance framework. So my understanding is, and I will make sure this is right and write to the committee if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that all of the bodies that are covered by that governance provision are compliant with it.
That isn't what I've heard.
Right.
But, so
well, that's why I should check.
Yes, I would be interested.
If you can help me with where you think it isn't,
yeah,
that will probably be helpful to start my search.
The other thing I wanted to ask then is if they are compliant, and it would be wonderful if they are, are you aware of what number of those positions are non-exec directors as opposed to people who hold substantive posts in organisations?
Off the top of my head, no. One of the governance provisions, as I recall it, is a certain number of independent people on the board, but I don't know how that interacts with the gender requirements, so we'll have to check.
Would you be able to provide that information as well?
We can certainly look. I would have thought, given there are 58 bodies, it would be feasible, but let me perhaps come back to you on that.
Thank you. I want to move on to the Football Association, an organisation we've had in front of this committee on a number of times, often in a very unsatisfactory way. And I think one of my first questions when I was on this committee was to the then chair, Greg Dyke, where I asked if the FA was fit for purpose, because it was my view then, and is probably still my view now, that it isn't. I understand that 21 of the 126 members of the FA Council, only 2 of the 10 FA board, both who are independent non-execs, and only 4 of the 13 senior managers are women.
Right.
Do you think that's acceptable?
Well, as I say, the expectation we have in terms of governance is set out in the governance code, and that includes 30% women in this context. So it wouldn't be in compliance with that expectation.
They definitely are not. Those figures are accurate.
Well, that's helpful to know. I will check that. And if it's not in compliance with our governance expectations, then of course we wish to bring them into compliance with those expectations. What I think it is true to say is that football more generally would benefit from greater attention to diversity. We are aware already, not just of gender diversity issues, but of racism in football, which I think the FA are at least recognising needs significant action. And you are aware that my colleague, the Sports Minister, has been speaking to the FA and to others about what further action we need to take.
And indeed, we did a session on that.
Indeed. And I think we all need to apply pressure. I would also say I think we all need to applaud those players like Raheem Sterling who have shown a lead on this. And I actually take the view that I would have huge respect for those players who choose to stay on the field, as he said that he would, and win the game to make their point. I also think we should respect those players who take the view that this is my place of work. No other employee would be expected to put up with this kind of thing at their place of work, and I'm not going to stay. I think that's equally to be respected, and one of the things that I think we need to look at is to make sure that players who do take that view and take that action don't suffer unduly for it.
And finally, the FA have recently appointed a new chief executive, and of the final 2 people, that are the only 2 public names available, they were men. Do you think this was a missed opportunity to try and increase their diversity?
Well, I don't know, and I won't comment on the individuals. I know my colleague, the Sports Minister, has met the new chief executive. I haven't. People for the positions they have, but they also have to pay attention to the need to make sure there's a diversity of views, backgrounds, and genders, ethnic origins, in the course of football more generally. That's why we've set out the governance expectations that we have. You've drawn my attention to the problem there may be there, and we'll need to have a look at that. But I'm not going to criticise the FA for the appointment they've made. What I will do is make sure that they are meeting the governance expectations that we have of them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you. A couple of questions on societal lotteries generally, I suppose. Can you confirm that it's still the government's intention to publish the response to the consultation, and will it still be out by the summer recess? And could you just maybe give us an explanation as to why it has taken so long, a consultation on society lotteries at close in September, to take almost a year to report?
Yeah. So the answer to the first two questions is yes, that's still the intention. So yes to publish, and yes to publish before the summer recess. That's very much what we want to do. Why is it taking so long? Because there is quite a difficult balance to be struck here between the interests of the National Lottery and the interests of the society lotteries. What we all want, what we all agree on, is for both to benefit. A rising tide that lifts all boats. That's what we're all wanting to achieve. But to design that is not as straightforward as it looks. The committee will be conscious that I have not just a moral obligation, but a statutory obligation to protect the interests of the National Lottery. And so it's important that I take that seriously and that I consider properly not just what everyone said in the consultation, as we are, but also how you balance out the need for society lotteries to prosper, particularly for those larger society lotteries that could do more for good causes but are bumping their head on a particular ceiling, whilst making sure that the National Lottery's interests are preserved too. That's not easy. That's why it's taking some time. But as the committee will have detected, my attitude to all things is I want to try and make sure I get it right.
So is the response, as it currently stands today, do you think it is in a position where it will be ready to be published by the end of July?
I hope so. I hope so.
Is it your expectation that it is?
Yes.
So anyone watching this could fairly put their house on that it will be.
I wouldn't recommend they put their house on anything. I agree engaging in lotteries is gambling, but I don't think you should gamble to that extent. But it is my expectation that that's what we will do. We're working very hard to make sure we can meet that expectation.
You talked a little there about the National Lottery. How concerned are you about the state of the National Lottery at the moment? And have you done an assessment on is the public's appetite still there for the lottery? The National Lottery?
Well, I think if you look at the evidence, the performance by way of ticket sales and returns has stabilised after what's been a difficult period. We move, of course, as the committee knows, towards the award of the fourth lottery licence in 2023, and we'll need to begin that process next year. So it's important that we give all those who may be prospective bidders for that licence a clear view of what they're bidding for. It's one of the reasons why I think we need to make progress on the society lotteries consultation, because it's not illegitimate for those who might want to consider their bids for that lottery licence to ask, well, what are the society lotteries going to be doing while I'm running the lottery if I'm successful? So that's one of the reasons those two things are interconnected. I don't think anyone would dispute there have been difficulties, but I think that the position is stabilising. If Camelot wish to bid again for the licence, then of course their bid will be considered in conjunction with any other bids that may be received.
And finally, a predecessor committee to this, the government agreed to look at legislation for umbrella lotteries. Can you update us on what progress has been made?
Well, there are, of course, umbrella lotteries in existence. It's one of the challenges around the society lotteries consultation, that we're not just dealing with small society lotteries, we're dealing with agglomerations of society lotteries into what are, as you say, umbrella organisations. That's one of the design questions we have to consider in this process. So the proposals that we make for reform in this area will include what should be done about umbrella lotteries.
Have you any idea of timescale of when that could...
Same timescale. So these are proposals that will come together. So we intend to get to the point where we're producing these before the end of the summer term, before the recess.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Final question from Giles Watling.
Yes, I'll try and be brief because you've given us a lot of time this afternoon, Secretary of State, and really appreciate that. You'll be aware of the Saudi Arabia-based pirate TV service Be Out Q.
Yeah.
That is misappropriating content from the UK's creative industries. What is the government doing to prevent them from misappropriating our content?
So there are two things that are being done. So there is activity at a diplomatic level, and the embassy in Riyadh is speaking to the Saudis on this subject. In terms of government, the lead department is the Department for International Trade. And I know colleagues in that department are also pursuing this matter, and from a DCIS point of view, we help wherever we can, but the lead department is DIT.
It's also misappropriating our sport. They're doing live broadcasts of sport, and there's a large regional satellite operator headquartered in Riyadh. And have the UK government made representations directly with the government of Saudi Arabia on that misappropriation?
Yes, that's my understanding, and that's happened, as I say, through diplomatic channels and indeed through Department for International Trade. And of course, you're right, and the Premier League and others are concerned about intellectual properties. They inevitably would be, and it's important that we preserve intellectual property rights. If we want to see good quality sport, we have to make sure that people are able to protect those rights so they can carry on delivering it to us. And those who are seeking to undermine those rights, of course, undermine that process. So that's why we take an interest. It's why we understand and sympathise with the concerns the Premier League and others have expressed. And as I say, there is activity underway. It is primarily led at diplomatic levels and by the Department for International Trade.
Right, and you'll be aware that in April, that Discovery and BBC announced plans for a new global streaming service, and now with B@Q, with 400 million, I believe, broadcasting to, and it's broadcasting, I think, about 100 of our UK-based TV channels. Have you had conversations with BBC Discovery about how they're going to commercialise their streaming in the face of that?
Not about this specific issue, I haven't. But as you say, there is considerable interest in the BBC, and I welcome that, in expanding what they do. And I think a greater global presence for the BBC brand is good news for the UK. I think we should encourage it. We need to make sure, of course, as I say, the intellectual property of BBC products, as much as anyone else's products, are defended. But I welcome the ambition the BBC have in this space, and we'll carry on discussing it with them.
Very, very grateful, as is my previous life. I've got robots contacting. Thank you.
I'll follow up on that. I'm slightly intrigued as to why the Department for International Trade is leading on this issue, when this issue of B&Q is straightforward. Piracy, it's copyright infringement, as it affects all the creative sector, particularly sports organisations, to sell their rights. It's like concerned if this was being, if our interest in this issue and addressing it is being balanced with other trade interests in the region.
Well, no, I don't think that's what I mean to suggest. There has to inevitably be a lead government department in all of this. Although I entirely accept the committee's interest and my department's interest in it, as it happens, DIT is taking the lead on this, but you'll find, I think, no discrepancy between my view and the view of my colleague, the Secretary of State in that department, as to how serious this is, and we seek to engage with the parties we've discussed on it, and that's my understanding will continue.
What I'm saying is that some of these, some people are accessing the service through receiving satellite footage. Others are receiving it through the internet as well, including potentially in this country too. Would the government consider measures to try and block access to that site from?
I think we're some way off that, but I think the best thing for me to do is to liaise with my colleagues at DIT and perhaps write to the committee as to where we are, so that I can give you a clearer update.
Thank you. Secretary of State, thank you very much. It's been 2.5 hours. Appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Sound. The proceeding has ended.